of all, I'd just like to give you a really warm welcome again to UBJS. I don't feel I need to tell you what we're about now. I'm sure you've all heard enough about us in recent weeks. So this is now our third event, and we're following from talks from journalists talking about journalism and how to get into journalism. And we're we're hearing from a journalist who's going to talk about current affairs and the issues of our time. And tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from the renowned author and journalist Peter Hitchens. He's the author of 6 books, including The Abolition of Britain and The Cameron Delusion. He's also worked as a foreign correspondent in the old Soviet Union, North Korea and the US, and he's currently a columnist for the Mail on Sunday and is frequently interviewed on the television for asking for his opinion on things. Therefore, it's a great honour to have him here with us this evening, and he's going to be talking about, does our government have any right to rule us? So can we all give a very warm welcome to Peter Hitchens. Thank you.
Good evening. Am I audible? Can you hear me? I don't want people to say afterwards they couldn't hear me. Even if they wouldn't have liked it, I want to know that they heard me. The principal purpose of this evening is to annoy Mrs. Theresa May, the Home Secretary. I hope you will all join me in that purpose because it's very important that we do so. This is actually the woman and the member of the government which set out in law to ban what it termed as extremist speakers from universities and to get universities, schools and kindergartens to be on the alert for extremists. For the purposes of this evening, and indeed for the purposes of Mrs. May, I am an extremist because under the government's official definition of extremism, I am critical of the concept of democracy, which is supposed to be a core British value which you're not allowed to have any doubts about. And that actually seriously means that under the government's code of practice, I should be monitored. And indeed, I am being monitored, as all of you are being monitored, probably rather more than the government would like to admit. The one main thing which emerged from last week's extraordinary plan to monitor all your metadata, and if you don't know what that means, it was summed up by a Guardian editorial last week as metadata may sound boring, but anyone in possession of these pieces of information about you will not merely know that you're gay before your mother does, but will know you're gay before you do. It goes that deep into the kind of things that you do, the amount of watching which this government actually proposes to do. But the main actual announcement that they made last week was that they'd been mining and trawling all that data for 14 years under an act passed in 1984, which they hadn't mentioned gave them that power. That's the kind of society we now live in, a society in which governments casually monitor our activity as if we were all guilty, classify us as extremists, and treat us essentially as serfs. And I think that under those circumstances it's worth examining whether these people do have any real right to rule us, or whether that right should be increasingly questioned if we wish to remain free people. So, I'm not going to detain you for long with an immense harangue, because only spellbinders can do that, and I'm not one of those. But I just want to set out to you the reasons why I say that there is a serious argument for suggesting that the current political establishment of this country doesn't really have any right to rule us and ought to be replaced by something better. First of all, there is the question of democracy. Now, what is it and why are we so keen on it? We frequently invade countries saying that we're going to introduce democracy there. This usually fails. Or alternatively, we put pressure on countries to be more democratic. The principal country where we did this recently was Egypt, a story which ended, alas, in a military coup and the massacre of hundreds of people in the streets by the current leader of Egypt, who, although he did this, was last week welcomed in London as an honoured guest, although we apparently claim to be against this kind of thing when other people do it, notably President Assad of Syria. So killing your own people is all right sometimes, but not all right at others. But if you can work out what the formula is, do let me know, because I can't. So there is this question, first of all, democracy. Now, democracy really means no more than you can get a lot of people to vote for you. In the old days of the Soviet Union, where I once lived, but before I was there, Joseph Stalin used to stand in elections for the Supreme Soviet. And invariably, he would obtain more votes in his constituency than there were people. And this would be explained by officials who would say that the comrades living in neighbouring constituencies were so anxious to vote for Comrade Stalin that they crowded across the borders of his constituency, ignored their own, and voted for him. Now, you may believe that or you may not. The fact is that in countries such as the Soviet Union, right up until the time that they collapsed, voting was more or less compulsory. You were expected to do it because those regimes valued enormously the legitimation which it gave them. They could say, we actually got these people to vote for us. Now, you may think this absurd. The circumstances under which they voted would be that you would go into a voting station and there would be two boxes. One would be to vote in favour of the Communist Party candidate, and this box was behind a curtain and you were treated like a normal human being. The other was to vote against the Communist Party candidate, and you voted in public and your name was taken. So it wasn't particularly surprising that most people voted for the Communist Party candidate. Nonetheless, the fact that millions of people did this was taken as legitimation and was often trumpeted as such, and you will find many of the worst countries in the world, notably the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the former German Democratic Republic, made a huge fetish about how democratic they were. In fact, it's little known now, but the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany as you know it, actually had several opposition non-communist parties in its People's Chamber. It had a Conservative Party and a Liberal Party and a Christian Democrat Party, and these existed alongside the Socialist Unity Party and were allowed to exist as long as they didn't fundamentally disagree with the government of the day. In fact, as long as they weren't extremists, one might say. So these parallels become more alarming the more you look at them. Now I must ask you to examine what happens in this country at election time. Now the other night I said on a BBC programme, as I've said before, that the current government is the best government that hedge funds could buy. And this is not in fact a jest. The hedge funds did contribute very substantially both to individual candidates and to the Conservative Party as a whole, and they contributed to an immensely sophisticated campaign. If you look at the election results, I did a long analysis on my blog, which you can study. There was no profound swing towards the Conservative Party in the country as a whole. In some constituencies, including the one I live in, one of the few in southern England with a Labour MP, there was actually a trend towards Labour because, as I will now explain, there was no reason for the Conservative Party's immensely wealthy machine to concentrate on that constituency and do the extremely sophisticated voter targeting which they did in those which they regarded as winnable. What happened was that in a number of marginal constituencies, as I say, hugely costly and hugely sophisticated actions were taken to shift the vote just enough to get a Conservative MP. They were so lacking in confidence about this, and they didn't believe that they could win it. They were so lacking in confidence, they believed that they would achieve another Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition. The confidence was in fact so low that George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said the night before the election that he would French kiss Linton Crosby, the Conservative Party election strategist, if they got an overall majority. I regret to have to tell you he didn't fulfill that promise. It would have been nice to have seen it, but they really didn't believe they would get it. But it was designed to achieve what is effectively a seizure of power on the back of money, rather than an election victory of the kind which used to take place in this country when there were more or less evenly matched parties standing on reasonably equal terms over several hundred constituencies. It was a manipulation of the system, and a very clever one, which allowed them to obtain a parliamentary majority. It was not a popular victory. It doesn't seem to me to be any more than a victory on points. Then move on to the next question of members of parliament. Who are they? How do you become one? People often write to me, I can't think why, but they do. They write to me and say, why don't you become a member of parliament? And I write back and I say, because it's impossible. Anybody who has anything remotely resembling original ideas or shows any signs of having any sort of independence of mind or ability to think for themselves is automatically disadvantaged in the extraordinarily tight and closed selection systems which the main parties use to pick their candidates for their safe seats. I could perhaps stand as a Conservative candidate in a mining area, a former mining area in Scotland, where I would have no hope whatever of winning. or as a Labour candidate, perhaps in Torquay. But I could not stand, and nobody like me could conceivably stand, as a Tory candidate in Torquay or as a Labour candidate in a former mining area in Scotland. It wouldn't be allowed because they wouldn't have anybody of that kind. These processes, as you will find if you're politically ambitious, are extremely tight in the constituency, but they are also supervised by very, very powerful central party machines, which can and do remove people who they believe to be inconvenient before the election comes. So the actual process of elections to Parliament in this country is a process first of all controlled by small party cliques, and then confirmed by, and this is the really baffling bit of it, then confirmed by the voting public. There is almost no instance in modern history of anybody winning a parliamentary seat at a general election unless they have the endorsement of one of the major parties. It is almost unknown for an independent to win it. By elections where people feel they're off the leash, it sometimes happens. But at general elections, it simply doesn't. People will say in any area, if you put an Alsatian or a gorilla or a baboon up here with a red or blue rosette, that person would win. And they say it as if to say it's ridiculous, but in fact, in general, we are in many cases faced with gorillas, Alsatians and baboons in our own constituencies, and we vote for them because they're wearing the appropriate rosette. Voting in this country is tribal. The two tribes vote. The problem with this in modern Britain is those tribes have shrunk. In 1945, in 1950, in 1951, in 1955 even, if you look at the figures, you'll find that the country was more or less evenly divided between a Labour Party, which was broadly of the left, and a Conservative Party, which was broadly of the right, and that was where almost all votes came from. And they were generally sincerely meant, and the people who voted for those members of Parliament voted for people quite like them. Labour MPs in those days tended to be people who were trade unionists, people who had come from socialist areas of society. Conservative MPs tended to be conservative people. That's all gone. And what you'll also find is that the largest single party in this country is now the party of none of the above. The people who either don't vote or actually deliberately don't vote or don't know how to vote, they outnumber the number of people who vote for any of the major parties. And yet, at election time, the minorities who do vote for these tribal parties can determine the outcome of the election and install the government. Is this democracy? Well, perhaps it is. Is it actually an expression of the popular will? Not at all. Is it under the influence of press manipulation and indeed of financial manipulation by very powerful and wealthy donors? Yes, it is. Is it legitimate? Well, in legal terms, it's legitimate, because what you've done at these elections, if you have voted for one of these parties, is you've given it the right to say that it has a popular mandate. But has it really got one? Have any of the political parties, have any of the governments of the past 25, perhaps 30 years, actually had such a genuine popular mandate? I think not. And I think very much it's the case that this current government, which was elected, has no popular mandate at all. Apart from anything else, it wasn't even prepared to be honest about what it intended to do, not least was because it never expected or intended to govern on its own, and therefore put in its manifesto all kinds of promises it never had any intention of keeping, and kept its real agenda to itself in the hope that coalition negotiations would allow it to do so. This level of dishonesty is not just comical, though it is in a way comical, it's actually very serious as well, because it means that what we're doing at election time is giving supposedly democratic legitimacy to groups of people who don't really have any connection with us at all, who despise us, and whose attitude towards our political system is one of total bought cynicism. This seems to me to suggest that we cannot actually regard them as having any real right to govern, my fundamental point. What we need to do about this is a much more complicated thing, but it really fundamentally rests upon you, whether you are prepared to continue to participate in this farce, whether every 5 years you're going to go into the polling booth where you're treated simultaneously as an illiterate and a thief, you're given a piece of paper on which to scratch an X as if you couldn't write, and you're made to do this with a pencil which is attached to the table with a piece of string so you don't steal it. This is what they think of you. And every 5 years to do that, and by doing so to legitimize somebody who's actually has no connection with your will or anybody else's, whose party has been bought and sold by people with with immense amounts of money and other agendas from the ones they've announced to you. That was the point I came to make. That's the point on which I'm very happy to take any number of questions or challenges, but I don't want to detain you any longer with a lengthy harangue. Thank you. So does anybody want to ask any questions, or can we all go to...
Yes. So you don't vote then?
Sorry, I have to come
you
you probably.
Do you vote?
No, I haven't. I was discussing with my hosts earlier on this evening when I last voted, and I couldn't remember. I can remember voting Labour in 1979. Actually, very cynically, I was a member of the Labour Party at the time, and I worked for the parliamentary campaign of Ken Livingstone in the Hampstead constituency. But I knew he'd lose, so it didn't matter whether I worked for him or whether I voted for him. I think I may have voted in 1983, but I can't remember doing so since. I would ask you, do you go into a shop and buy goods you don't want? Because it seems to me to be roughly the same thing. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Do you think that we could use Lord's reform to kind of untangle it from the web of the...
Lord's reform?
Yeah, that you could make the second chamber so...
It's a very interesting possibility. But the problem with it is this. First of all, the public attitude towards the Lords is completely upside down. For many years, before the Blairites got hold of it, the Lords was actually probably, in terms of representing the popular will, a more democratic chamber than the Commons. The thing I didn't mention about members of Parliament is once they've been selected, they become the employees of the executive. They're not employed by the people who voted for them, they're employed by the political party which has elected them, which can discipline them if they stand out of line. There are two ways of doing this. One is that they can withhold from them promotion into well-paid jobs, withhold from them the chance of being put into the House of Lords or given other honours. The other is they can make their lives a misery. The other is they can put the word around in their constituency that they're no good and get them deselected. And this pressure is very considerable, and these people, as a result, are, if they're government MPs, almost in all cases, tools of Downing Street and unable to do anything else. Whereas the House of Lords, who, even if it was their great-grandfather happened to have, or rather their great-grandmother happened to have slept with Charles II, or whatever it happens to be, were no longer beholden in this way because they'd inherited the title and from someone who'd inherited it 5, 6, 7 times, and whoever it was they'd got the original favour from was very dead. And therefore they were completely at liberty to vote whichever way they liked, according to conscience or intelligence or common sense or their knowledge of the subject. And this House of Lords, which existed before the Blairites, was an extremely defensible body. But everybody swallowed the idea that it was somehow an affront to democracy and had to be got rid of, and that the House of Commons should be given more power. How would you devise a House of Lords which didn't have those problems? An elected House of Lords which wasn't controlled by the parties, which couldn't be controlled by the executive? I'm not sure. And the problem is the existing House of Lords has been so polluted by the way it's been filled up with appointees who have current debts to current people, that even though it does sometimes perform a good deal better than you might expect, I don't see how you can refashion it so that it could be the sort of House of Lords it was before the Blairites, or turn it into something new. Unless you can take the political party machines out of the equation, I'm really not sure how you can do that. My own view about the fundamental point of reform, the place where you apply the lever and push, is that what we actually need is new political parties, and that we need to destroy the two existing political parties, neither of which really represent anybody but themselves, and replace them with ones that do. And the difficulties of this are illustrated by what's happened in the Labour Party, which has, to the astonishment of so many people, been captured by socialists, and this horrifying event has reduced, particularly the media, to a state of utter shock. How can this be allowed to happen? Imagine what happened if the Conservative Party were captured by Conservatives. Where would we be? Yes, please. Could back is the...
You mentioned about the Tory party.
Can you shout?
You mentioned about the Tory party concentrating on their marginal seats, the marginal seats.
Yes.
You then, what would you propose an alternative voting system?
No, I would propose a very strict limit on the amount of money that parties were allowed to spend, and a very strict limit on the amount that any individual or company was allowed to contribute to any political party. I think that's fundamental to any kind of real legitimacy in voting. The moment you allow people, individuals or companies or hedge funds to deploy large sums of money, so large that the other party is swamped, then it's immediately unfair and, as far as I'm concerned, indefensible. I'm actually very much in favour of the first past the post system because of two things. One, the wonderful way in which governments can be turned out of office totally, which never happens on the European continent. You throw out the existing government and members of it will almost invariably form part of the new government. To actually see an ex-prime minister having to move out of Downing Street with a removal van, piano and all, is a great triumph for the people's will. And something I would be loath to lose. The other thing is that sometimes you do need strong, decisive government. And you can't have it without first past the post and the majority to provide. So I'm not too keen on electoral reform or AB. I think we should treasure first past the post as long as we can. But the real key to stopping the manipulation of the system is controlling very, very hard the amount of money which people can contribute to political parties. Well, yeah. Would it help if you chose the people rather than me, or whatever you like?
Where does this fit the European Union in terms of legitimacy from us and how any control?
Well, the European Union is actually sadly more legitimate than some of its opponents like to accept. We should never have held the 1975 referendum, which was, as far as I'm concerned, an outrage against the Constitution. And it was one of the occasions when I did vote, and I voted only at the last minute, to my great relief, I voted no. But this should never have happened. Parliament should have been sovereign. But the truth is that people were told far more about it than they now claim to have been. And the opponents of common market membership, as it then was, made it quite plain, as loudly as they could, what a menace it was to national independence and sovereignty and how it would supplant those things and take them over. And subsequently, Jacques Delors, in his great speech to the TUC, which turned the Labour Party pro-European, I think predicted that 80% of important legislation in European Union member countries would issue from the European Union. So it's difficult to say that it's illegitimate in straightforward terms, that it's never honestly presented itself to us, or we've never been given the chance to say no. That doesn't mean that there is not an argument for leaving, but it seems to me to be a much more difficult argument than most people understand, and will prove, if and when this referendum ever comes, will prove to be a much harder case to make than I think the no camp, or sorry, the leave camp as it's now called, think that it will, because it's an awful lot of people have actually in their hearts accepted, which I think is a mistake, but they have accepted that this country ought to be in part ruled from abroad. So, alas, I can't say it's as legitimate as I would like to say it was.
How do MPs like Philip Davis from Shipley square with your theory that they're all doing the party machine controls them?
Well, put it like this, I don't think Philip Davis's influence on the politics of this country is very great. I think that of course it's possible for parties to accept a certain number of marginal figures who can be expected at almost any time to vote against the whips. And the existence of such people, I've never thought that the phrase "the exception that proves the rule" is any use. But the existence of such people doesn't establish that there is general independence. The existence of such people, the rarity of such people, seems to me to establish that my argument is broadly right. There aren't many of them, and in fact, if there were, the party system as at present constituted would probably break apart. The problem is that Philip Davis is not in any way a supporter of the policies of the party which he represents, really. There's hardly any point on which he agrees with David Cameron or the party, except in a kind of passive way in which there are things which are never addressed, on which they might agree, but which are never contested and which never come up for debate. So no, I don't think that really undermines the argument. If there were 200 Philip Davises, then it would, but I don't think there ever will be. It's in the nature of parties that they will select people who are broadly in tune with what they want, and this is why I find, if you really want to alter this, it's the creation of new parties that you need to attempt. But to create new parties in our system, we need to undermine and destroy the existing ones.
Hello, my name's Wesley. My question is, with the Labour Party in the state it is now, should we be frightened of a one-party system?
The first bit of the question was...
So, with the leadership change of the Labour Party and the decline of the amount of MPs the Liberal Democrats have, should we be frightened of a one-party system where the Conservatives are the only party that...
Possibly, but the thing about Jeremy Corbyn is his capacity to surprise. Most people in the political, closed political world of Westminster and Westminster journalism thought that he couldn't become leader of the Labour Party. The same people now think that he can't become Prime Minister. Now, looking at circumstances as they are, you'd have to say they have a point. But circumstances may not stay as they are. I mean, we are, as it happens, although it's not referred to, because nobody can think of what to do about it, we are in a very major economic crisis. The reason why interest rates don't go up is because if interest rates went up, there would be an economic catastrophe, there would be a crash. But the reason why interest rates are so low is because the economy is so crippled that it can barely move. And therefore, we're stuck both ways. You can neither put this right nor act to get out of it because it's so serious. And if, as seems quite possible, if the Chinese economic growth slows any further, and this is fundamentally what's keeping the world economy and the European economy and the American economy going at the moment, if that happens, then we could actually in this country face really serious problems. We do already have very big difficulties. The huge debts accumulated, the 1.5 trillion national debt that is completely unpayable by the government, the vast personal debts which have also been accumulated by individuals, again unpayable, have never existed in any country before on this scale without hyperinflation eventually resulting. I have to say I find this a very worrying circumstance. We have all the preconditions for that, but the thing itself isn't happening. And then you have this attempt to pose as a wealthy first world country with advanced health services, transport services, education, all the rest of it. It almost invariably defeated by the fact that we can't afford it. And not merely that we can't afford it, but that we have become in many ways too incompetent to do it. I take, for instance, the electrification of the Great Western Railway line, which has, in the course of, I think, 18 months, tripled in cost, because nobody knows how to electrify railways in this country anymore. All the people who know how to do it went off to work in the Far East years ago, and we just don't have the competence, just as we have dissolved the incredibly advanced technology and skill centres which we had in civil nuclear power. All vanished, so we have to turn to China, for goodness sake, not a country with a particularly good reputation in this field, to build nuclear power stations for us. So we're neither rich as we think we are, nor as good at doing things as we think we are. And I think there are many reasons why to suspect that we could be in very serious economic and political trouble before the end of this Parliament, in which case, who knows whether you might or might not be seeing Jeremy Corbyn waving from the steps of Downing Street rather sooner than we think. It's not impossible. So from that point of view, I don't think that that's particularly a risk. The main danger is whether there's any freedom of movement in the political world which would allow him, if he did come to power, to do anything substantially different from what we have. And to that extent, we may be run by a story.
Hi, so you want to destroy the main political parties. Do you think it's possible that could happen anytime in the near future? And if not, do you think that it's practical or helpful not to do it?
Well, I've spent the past 7 years of my life concentrating on an attempt to destroy the Conservative Party, which I have to say has met with almost total failure. So I don't really know I can offer much in the way of hope to anybody who wants to destroy any of the others, or indeed that one. Maybe my chosen method was the wrong one. Maybe national newspaper columnists don't actually have any influence at all. It's a very small amount of influence some people think they do. I don't know. I think circumstances may end up destroying both the major political parties. Some of the ones I've just described, the promises they make, the premises on which they're constructed, just seem to me to be increasingly invalidated by real life. I think I watched the other, again, this is on question time, last Thursday, the Secretary of State for Overseas Development, or whatever it's called this week, Justine Greening, telling an audience of people in Tottenham in London that it was actually quite easy for young people to get on the housing ladder in that city. And it just met with gales of laughter. She had absolutely no idea of what the true situation was. And I think in many other cases of senior politicians, they simply do not know how bad it is, and the distance between them and people is so great that maybe it won't need me to undermine these parties. Maybe they will collapse of their own accord, but maybe we have to have a crisis first. The problem with crises and catastrophes, and this is one thing I did learn during my time in Russia, is that they do actually happen. And people survive them and live in the world following them as ghosts of their former selves. It is possible for major advanced societies to undergo these terrible crises, and that may change it all. I wish we didn't have to wait for that, but I sometimes wonder whether it is the difficulty. People will not act on these things until they're faced with absolute, terrible, disastrous crises.
Good evening, Peter. Two of the themes which I found most interesting in your talk were the problems we have with funding parties and with this lack of independence, this centralisation which is taking place in the main political parties in the UK. I used to be of the view that one of the great strengths of the political system in Britain was that we had these great traditions which weren't sort of contrasted with European one-person parties which would wave away when the political player was unelected. But partly because you were talking, but also before I come to the view that this isn't really this lack of independence which parties now sort of cause means that view is no longer that strong. So what would you propose in terms of addressing this hedge fund funding in parties and the centralisation which is taking place in British politics?
Well, I've already said what I think about party funding. I think that's quite straightforward, a very, very tight limit on contributions. But in terms of centralisation became necessary because the remaining members of the two dying political parties were actually not very much in tune with the leadership cliques in London who controlled those parties in all other ways, and they had to be disciplined. There was a famous episode of the 2005 general election of a member of Parliament called Howard Flight, a Conservative member, who made a speech, actually in private, which was deemed to be so far outside Conservative policy, it wasn't particularly, but it was deemed to be, that he was actually sacked by the Conservative Party as a candidate centrally, a thing which would previously have been unheard of. Centralisation is a consequence of something else rather than perhaps a deliberate feature of the profound gulf between the activists of the old Labour Party, who still in many ways were imbued with the ideas of old-fashioned socialism, and the new Labour clique, which were imbued with the ideas of Gramscianism and Eurocommunism, which had very little in common with that. And in the Conservative Party, again, though they don't understand it, they're also imbued with the ideas of Eurocommunism and a Gramscian battle to capture hegemony. And they don't have much to do with Anglican farmers in Gloucestershire either, so they have this problem as well. They can't actually allow them to control the process of selection, which was their main source of power. What to do about it, as I say, is somehow or other to redesign our political parties so we have ones which represent much more the divisions in the country. I would say you could sum up the divisions in the country much more by now, as this is no simplification, but I think you'll know what I mean, by contrasting people who read and like the Daily Mail on one side and people who read and like the Guardian on the other. The divisions are, in many cases, cultural and moral as much as they are economic, but that's the real line of division which runs down the middle of this country, and in fact it's not reflected at all in Parliament. Both major parties are on the Guardian side now, although some of them do some Daily Mail type rhetoric when it suits them. In reality, they're both on the Guardian side, and I think that what would certainly make things a lot more interesting would be if there were a genuinely conservative formation in this country. And I would like it to be opposed by a genuine Polly Toynbee formation, which argued very strongly, yes, we stood up and said, yes, we long to stay in the European Union, we really like it. We like political correctness. We like all these we like all these things that at the moment they pretend to be embarrassed about. Openly to say this is what we believe. The very fine recent history, The English and the History by Robert Toombs, in which he argues, and I think he's right, that the old party system was more or less an argument between two different forms of Christianity. Fundamentally a sort of Anglican and a very Protestant view, and that was the division. It continued. The Labour Party was far more Methodist than Marxist until very recently, for instance. But that's gone. Christianity as a major source of thought has vanished in our society, so we need to look somewhere else. But I'd say how these things will happen, unless and until the existing parties can be made to collapse, I'm not sure, but I do think they need to happen if we're to have any kind of genuinely representative system.
Hi, on your argument of the 1975 election making the EU more legitimate, yes, so much more money was pumped into the yes campaign and the no campaign, yet our voter turnout to the EU elections far lower than even the national elections. So surely that contradicts your argument of pumping money into political parties.
Well, it would undermine the argument if I made it enthusiastically, but I make it reluctantly. I don't want this to be true. But what one finds if one looks at that campaign, and if, like me, you actually remember it, is that the case which is constantly made by people, oh, they told us it was just a free trade organisation, they never told us it had any political aspect, is just not true. Leaflets were delivered by the government to every home in which the truth was told, and people ignored them. Major politicians, they may not have been popular politicians, they were major politicians, Enoch Powell and Tony Benn, together for once on the same course, went around the country warning against this. I went to a lot of the meetings, it was actually a very lively campaign. It was the last time I remember seeing political meetings bigger than this in the centres of towns made up of perfectly ordinary people who'd gone out of interest, and they were divided quite evenly between one or the other. Open, actual, real discussions and debates. And yet, despite all this, despite the truth being told, people decided that actually they were going to vote for it. I wish it were not so. I'm not arguing that it is a good thing. I'm just saying if the people who are now campaigning for us to leave imagine that they're going to get much traction by saying we weren't told the truth and we've been lied to all along, they're mistaken. People did know, and actually they didn't care. And the real problem with any argument about the European Union is that most people don't care. They really don't care about it enough to risk the unknown of leaving it after nearly half a century of being in it. They really don't care enough. And that's the real problem the Leave campaign has. And my view has been from the start, I don't think David Cameron ever intended to keep the promise of a referendum, because he never expected to win the election. I think it was a promise he made, as he makes many promises, made on the basis that he wouldn't ever have to keep it. Now he's in this terrible bind of having to pretend that he's negotiating for reforms, which he knows perfectly well are non-existent, and that if he doesn't get them, he's going to have to recommend that we leave. But he's never going to do that because he doesn't want us to leave. So he's going to have to become a contortionist, the boneless wonder, somehow or other simultaneously being for and against it. And you're already seeing this happen. There's George Osborne's trip to Berlin last week, when the Germans were practically begging him, saying, please, will you tell us, what is it that you want? And he wouldn't tell them because he was afraid they'd say no. And if they said no, he couldn't then recommend staying. So this contortionism is going to go on, and in the background, people are going to be scared all the time by the CBI and lots of other people saying, if we leave, millions of jobs will be lost, which is a lie. If we leave, we'll be on our own. If we leave, our economic security will be in danger. If we leave, the weather will get worse. If we leave, there will be earthquakes. It will just go on and on and on. And when it finally comes, everyone will vote to stay out and stay in again. And it will then be legitimized for the next 50 years for good. And I've always been against it because I'm very much afraid that once we've had 2 votes to stay in the European Union, that'll be that. There won't be any other possibility of getting out. The only way to get out of the European Union is for a political party committed to leave, to win a general election and to form a government. There is no other way out, and there never was, and there never will be.
Do you think having primaries in sort of say seats for constituencies would help the process of sort of maybe taking the power away from the central parties?
Not necessarily. I think that the one argument in favour of that is that when the Conservative Party tried to have primaries, and Sarah Wollaston, amongst others, was picked as a result, they went off the idea and stopped doing it. And that's the best argument for it. They're obviously worried by it. But if it became general, I think that big money and the party machines would move in a much more active way to make sure that the right candidates were picked. So that the money would move one step further into the election system so that the primaries were as influenced by the hedge funds as the election itself. If they became important, they would become fixed. So I don't think it's necessarily the answer. And say, to achieve it with the existing political parties, you have to persuade them to do it. And it's perfectly plain they're not willing to do so. How are you going to make them do it?
Doesn't the failure of UKIP suggest that the public don't really like old-fashioned conservatism?
Well, I know about failure, and the failure of UKIP is in some very bad tactics in some cases. The decision, the very foolish decision that Nigel Farage made to stand for Parliament himself, which was always going to be extremely dangerous, because under the rule I set out in my initial harangue, it is almost impossible for anyone who doesn't belong to a major party to win a seat at the general election. Even with all the effort and skill that was put into trying to elect him, they couldn't get him in. In fact, they lost one of the seats that they got in the by-election, the Rochester and Street one. So that was a big mistake. If it hadn't been for that, then people would probably pay more attention to the very large vote that they got. A very substantial vote for the third party. But the problem is that how should I put this? The commentariat and the political atmosphere in general had very much decided that the Conservative Party should survive, and an awful lot of people have been persuaded to believe, falsely in my view, that the Labour Party was substantially different from the Conservative Party, and that it was worth having a Conservative government because in some way it would save us from terrible things which a Labour government would do, perhaps propped up by the SNP. This kind of fantasy, which is never true, and if we had a Labour government now, if we had an Ed Miliband government now, it would not be in any substantial way different from the government that we had. But this belief that was spread was successful. The other point I make about UKIP is it wasn't particularly conservative. What UKIP is a group of Thatcherite exiles. And Thatcherism is not conservative. Thatcherism is liberal. Thatcherism is Manchester liberal in economic policy, and extremely socially liberal in effect. It makes a few rhetorical noises about old-fashioned values, but in fact an awful lot of the old social and moral fabric of Britain was dismantled under Thatcherism. One would take, for instance, Sunday trading. Anything which a social conservative would very much want to protect the Christian Sunday, but the Conservative Party pushed ahead with getting rid of it. And take the biggest single unsung change which the Thatcher major governments achieved, the introduction of ambulance chasing, no-win, no-fee lawyers into this country, which transformed it and was the real reason for all the health and safety frenzy which we face, and has done limitless damage in so many ways. That was also not by any means a Conservative policy. UKIP is Thatcherite exiles, and Mr Farage himself has spoken in favour of the decriminalisation of drugs, for instance. There's nothing really Conservative about it. I'd love to see a socially Conservative party standing in some strength in every constituency in the country and see what happened, but we haven't had one yet. I don't think that proves anything. That's like saying that William Hague's period in opposition in the Blair years was in some way an attempt to try really conservative ideas. It wasn't. They didn't believe in them, and William Hague, as we found out later, was by no means a social or moral or anything other conservative. So no, I think the answer has to be no, that wasn't so.
Doesn't the fact that we actually approve the government's authority actually listen as a government?
I occasionally shock people by saying that I don't really think very much of democracy. I don't think that it's particularly wonderful. I know this is Godwin's law, but the truth is that Hitler came to power democratically, and indeed it is a legal fact that he ruled Germany from 1933 to 1945 lawfully under the provisions of the Weimar Constitution, which was supposed to be the most liberal constitution in the world heretofore. It's also the case that I value liberty far above democracy, and I think that democracy is often used as a weapon against liberty, particularly by unscrupulous governments, which will raise particularly the exaggerated fear of terrorism to get us to abandon liberties which are irreplaceable in return for unmeasurable and quite possibly non-existent security. So there is an interesting argument to be had about what the ideal form of government is. For me, I remember thinking, as the Soviet Union collapsed, first of all, an immense joy in the middle of Moscow that the day after, a couple of days after tanks had come down my street, and then they fled and they were gone. And all the rubbish bins in the centre of Moscow were full of discarded Communist Party membership cards, which people had set light to and were burning in little bonfires. It was a total transformation, and for me, an absolute glorious moment of joy. And then watching, in the years afterwards, the disastrous outcome of this, where outsiders came to them and said, what you must have the free market, which ripped what was left of their economy to pieces, and you must have democracy, which descended into corrupt rigging of the lowest kind. What Russia needed, and what every country needs if it's to be happy, is actually liberty and the rule of law. And these are incredibly precious things which we had in this country before we had democracy, and indeed which the United States had before it had democracy. People probably don't know the United States Senate wasn't directly elected until 1915 because the founding fathers of the United States believed that it should be actually very like the British House of Lords and be preserved from what they called the fury of democracy. I don't know what the ideal system is. What I'm absolutely certain of is that our system is, if not broken, then at least very badly bent. I'll be dead soon. It doesn't really matter much to me what happens, but for you lot, it's very important that you try to fix it. And you do have the opportunity, but one of the things that you have to do is to resist the propaganda which is constantly pushed towards you, particularly the propaganda making you give up your liberty, the propaganda which has already made us abandon proper jury trial and the presumption of innocence, which has made us abandon vital things like the right to silence and the rules against being tried twice for the same offence. Again and again, populist frenzies of one kind or another are used to persuade people to give up their birthright. Don't do that anymore. Try and get it back, because that's what your forebears really did and what they really fought for. And do not take at face value the promises of supposed democratic politicians who are merely trying to get you, with the use of huge sums of money, to legitimate their actually untrammeled exercise of power. Law, liberty, and justice are the things to go for, and everything which tends towards those you should fight for and defend. Everything else I beg you to be suspicious of it.
Hello. You've previously said on many platforms that if you were younger, maybe late 20s, early 30s, you'd emigrate. But you never, because you never given a place that you most want to go to, and a reason why that that country in general.
No, and nor will I ever. It's none of my business. If a refugee or an exile, which is what you would become if you left because this place became intolerable, is not a person going to somewhere, he's a person going from somewhere. You count yourself lucky if anybody will take you in, frankly. Once people realise what the true value of sterling is, you'll be lucky to find anybody that wants you. So it's not for me. I'm not some kind of travel bureau. Go somewhere nice. I'm saying, actually, I've never seen a country more bent upon its own ruin, economically, politically, socially, and morally. And I've seen a lot of countries, including some African ones. And the trouble with this one is that it doesn't realise how lucky it's been. It doesn't realise how much of its security rests only upon habits of the past, which are tremendously vulnerable. It doesn't realise how very rapidly it could sink into various... Last week, this supposedly advanced country very nearly suffered power blackouts. The staple of life in a third world country, which should never even be contemplated in an advanced state. Very, very nearly. And I think, given what happened, and this was on a mild day, far warmer than it ought to have been, given what happened, it's quite likely that we will suffer actual power cuts. This seems to me to be a good metaphor. This threat of sudden imposed darkness, when all your computers die and all your phones die and everything you do becomes impossible and the cities go dark. This is a very good metaphor for the way we're going. And under those circumstances, it seems to be frivolous to say, well, where would I choose to go? You may be one of those people who goes in the hope that somebody will take you in. And I think that is how bad it may become. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't seem to me to have anything to do with the question to say, oh, where would you go? As I say, you'll be lucky if anybody will have
you. Given the fact that UKIP and the Greens collectively have nearly 5 million votes, nearly 5 million votes, and only 2 seats in the Commons, do you not think that questions the legitimacy of the first past the post system?
No, I don't. I think that everything good has to be paid for in some way. There is no utopia, there is no perfection. The alternative that you'd have to overcome that problem would rob this country of the things which I described, the ability to throw out a government and the ability to elect a strong, determined government. You would never conceivably obtain a majority government committed to lead the European Union, for instance, under any other system than first past the post. And for that, I'm quite prepared to pay with the sufferings of UKIP and the Green Party. Thank you very much.
Hello? Yeah. I'll ask you one last question for you. Do you have any hope for the future about politics in this country? Any hope?
No. I've learned better. I could be wrong, in which case it's worth your while trying.
Well, thank you all so much for coming up. We've got another few events on coming up. We will be releasing a statement shortly about the event concerning gender politics, and we've also got an event with Owen Bennett-Jones on the 2nd of December. He'll be discussing should journalists break the law. So we've got exciting, we've also got a Bristol Post editor hopefully coming next term and some sports journalists. So it's exciting times, so do try and buy membership. Anyway, thank you all for coming in. We have one more last round of applause, Peter. Thank you.
Listen carefully.